Thank you, Shanor, and thank you everyone in this team, this incredible team behind relocations and the University of Toronto for putting this together. I know that despite us being an ocean apart, literally, I'm here joining you from the Philippines, 13 hours ahead, so it's 11 p.m. here. But despite this difference, there's so much that we're experiencing in very similar ways. Of course, the pandemic is upon us and it's front and center in our everyday lives now. It's remarkable that we're able to join together in this kind of technological platform. But at the same time, there's so much for us as scholars to look into, to interrogate in terms of the politics, in terms of the differential experiences of the pandemic depending on where people are, both geographically, economically, socially, and many other factors. So I'm very honored to be giving this lecture today with you, and my talk will be about medical populism and the global south. So my own analysis have dwelled in the US, in Brazil, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and I would like to share with you some of my insights about the politics of health, especially in terms of how individual political actors have responded to the pandemic. So now let me share my slides. So you can see here one image of Bolsonaro of Brazil and one image of a mascot that they created in the Philippines of the virus. So it seems that an intangible, an invisible virus has to be depicted. It has to be materialized, personified even, because it's so hard to imagine a virus. And of course, many people believe that it exists, and yet it relies on scientific knowledge for us to actually, we haven't seen it ourselves. We rely, in fact, it's not even color red. Apparently, there's no color. It's too small to have color as such. But by convention, scientists have depicted it as red. And when we think of coronavirus, we think of it as this red spiked ball, which is in itself construction. So there's really so much to unpack. And I will just present with you something very specific, looking at individual political actors at the national level. So even before COVID-19, we're seeing how medical emergencies have become a staple of news. Scandals, vaccine scandals all over the world. We've had the Ebola scare in 2014. We've had SARS in 2003 and even the bird flu afterwards. So there's so many different kinds of health crises that demand responses, and they're very vulnerable to politicization, especially in our age when it's so easy for someone like Donald Trump to tweet and make claims, whether true or false. So we use the concept of medical populism to make sense of all of these at the level of political leaders. So this picture is in Bangladesh. There was a big dengue outbreak in Bangladesh last year, and every day in the front page of the newspapers, dengue was in the news. And so the ruling party organized this massive event to mobilize the whole country, a campaign against dengue. There's fumigation, there's community level responses. And the politicians were all there. Somehow they had to dramatize their response to the dengue fever. Now, of course, when we talk about populism, it's almost like a cliche. Everyone uses the word, and even scholars have complained that it's become a cliche. But nonetheless, despite its overuse both in the public discourse, media, and also scholarship, it has still retained analytic usefulness, especially when we're able to define it precisely. So, our conceptualization of medical populism looks at populism itself not as a fixed set of content that's already predetermined, but it's a repertoire. It's a stylistic repertoire invoking Brubaker and also repertoires of performance from Benjamin Moffat. So they look at it as a style. It's not the content, but it's the way people forge divisions, people simplify things. So regardless of whether it's right wing or left wing populism, I'm not too interested in that. But I'm more interested in how populism emerges as a style in times of health crises and how technology has been mobilized in this age of communicative abundance. Now, we do not make I do not make any normative judgments or value judgments whether this style is good or bad necessarily, because even some scholars saw some emancipatory potential. So when you have as I will explain later, this is not necessarily negative, and then I do not make a value judgment whether this is good or bad. But I think it's very important for us to look at the styles. So again, health issues are highly amenable. There are many issues: immigration, economic populism, so many penal populism. But health issues are highly amenable because they tap into fears of disease and death. When we talk about a virus, a plague, a pandemic, it grips people. It taps into our fears, and they demand urgent responses from leaders. That's why politicians feel compelled to show that they're doing something right away. And it brings us to the point that when politicians make decisions about health, including about the pandemic, which I will focus on later, it creates two dimensions. One is the medical efficacy. Is it effective? Can it prevent the virus? But at the same time, political efficacy. Will this policy make me look better? Will it make me look popular? Will I win the election because of this? So there are two concerns that are involved here, not just the medical, but also the political. Now, we define, building on the scholarship from populism literature, we define medical populism, as a style that constructs antagonistic relations between the people whose lives have been put at risk by dangerous others, infectious others. It can be powerful elites. It can also be perceived threats to the nation, immigrants bringing viruses, and so on and so forth. So this picture is an example of this attorney in the Philippines who really decided to make a whole scandal out of the dengue vaccine and claiming that it killed children. So she put up performances, hysterical performances, and even collapsing in front of the cameras to show how affected she was by what's happening. So drama is a big element of medical populism, which brings me to the elements of this framework. First of all, simplification. Politicians simplify health crises either by downplaying it or even denying it, but also offering easy solutions. Chloroquine, antibodies, it's now coming. The vaccine is almost there. We will have it in 30 days or 3 months. That's simplification. But then there's also spectacularization. So this picture is an image in Honduras, I think, of the president dramatizing his response to dengue also last year. So mega operativo. He even used Dia de or D-Day, evoking World War II imagery to dramatize the response. This is like a war against dengue. So this Dia de or D-Day. And then so simplification, spectacularization, and then division as well. So when it comes to health crises, there's a tendency of political actors to be divisive about their claims, either by blaming people like Donald Trump, calling it the China virus, associating enemies, geopolitical, national political, and also social as either the culprits of the whatever's happening, or people who are undermining their responses. It can be journalists, it can be scientists. And of course, all of the three requires the invocation of knowledge claims. So some of my works have focused on looking at particular topics and analyzing how politicians politicize them, including immunization, the drug wars in Asia, how Duterte and other leaders say that it's the drugs are destroying the brain. It's a state of exception. It's destroying our country. Therefore, we need to act. We shouldn't care too much about human rights because lives are at stake. The nation is at stake. So, just to illustrate further the framework, first of all, simplification. So, we saw this in the 1990s in South Africa with President Mbeki resorting to HIV denialism, denying HIV altogether, saying that it's not really because of a virus. We also saw it last year again in Bangladesh with some mayors, some politicians downplaying the scale of the dengue, saying that this is not a real number. So again, the debate about numbers will figure in simplification. So that's one, denying it, downplaying. It's also offering easy solutions. I will solve this problem in 6 months. We will have the vaccine by Christmas. We will have the vaccine before the elections. So these are forms of simplification. And secondly, spectacularization. Again, this is an example of the Philippines with this public attorney really making it a crusade against this vaccine, supposed vaccine, and displaying these images of children who are supposed to have been killed. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's no evidence that they were actually they died because of the dengue vaccine. But she has performed these spectacles in front of the Supreme Court, holding up images of dead children with their parents. Very dramatic, very gripping, very compelling. The drug wars also we saw in the Philippines. In my own country, we saw people getting killed. I'm sorry if it's too graphic an imagery, but these are cardboard pictures, cardboard that's being put on dead bodies to say that I'm a drug lord or I'm a drug user. Now, aside from simplification and spectacularization, we also see the forging of divisions that are figuring in political responses to crises. Vaccines have been blamed as or vaccines have been portrayed as a Christian conspiracy against the Muslim world to eliminate Muslims. And it has led to fatal consequences in different parts of the world, including Pakistan, I think also Nigeria, where they stage a polio boycott, polio vaccine boycott. And like I said earlier, all of these rests on making knowledge claims. So these are the examples that I presented both in the immunization and the drug wars in Asia. But let me focus in this presentation, let me focus on the pandemic that's upon us. So although I talk about Donald Trump as well in this particular paper, for this presentation, I want to focus more on the global South examples. So we have Brazil, we have the Philippines, and these are still the same elements that we see: simplification, spectacularization, forging of divisions, and making knowledge claims. So simplification in the time of COVID-19 involves presidents, leaders claiming a cure, claiming a treatment, an effective treatment for the virus. So we saw it in Madagascar with the president himself dramatically drinking an herbal tea, announcing that this is actually a treatment or a cure, prevention for COVID-19. We saw this in Brazil with Bolsonaro claiming that this is a trick. It's just a flu. It's a media trick. He's saying that it's just theater. And he staged dramatic displays of going to bakeries, going to pharmacies, even though there are rising cases. And what's interesting with Bolsonaro is that he himself had contracted the virus, but then he used that as a justification for his actions. Like, look, see, I recovered. See, like I told you, it's not as serious as we have to take it like a man. So he tapped into people's sense of masculinity, saying that Brazilians don't catch it easily because they can even jump into the sewer and nothing happens. So he made a lot of claims, even using his own infection to bolster his claims. Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, mocking people for worrying too much about the pandemic. We also saw in Belarus dramatic playing hockey, even downplaying, dismissing the pandemic. Of course, this changes over time. And it's been several months since we've had the pandemic. So much has happened. So this is not fixed. Leaders can change their styles over time. So it's important to document it as it goes along. But what this example show is that this style is actually quite familiar. That it's quite common and can be found all over the global south. So again, Duterte offering a reward for a vaccine, 50 million pesos is basically around $1 million US. So as if it can is that easy to have a vaccine. But again, simplification. So in Tanzania, we have the president claiming that prayer has actually solved the problem and God has removed the virus in their country. So there's no need to wear face masks because God has already removed the virus. So obviously, this did not age well in that country. But the fact that leaders feel compelled to make these claims is quite something to think about. The commonalities across different contexts. So in Nicaragua as well, there's downplaying being done. Of course, this is not an irrational choice. There's a calculus behind this. There's a pitting of the economy against health. There are rhetorical devices that are being mobilized to justify these decisions. So we cannot just say that this is irrational. There's a political logic behind these actions. So we also see in Iran, a lot of downplaying there, despite rising cases. There's suspicion even of trying to control the numbers that are coming out. So going back to the cure, some more examples of making cures, uh, drinking cow urine. So again, very dramatic in India, in Greece, offering a balm to protect again from the virus. So many examples around the world of this happening. So this again is the Madagascar herbal cure. Somehow, maybe we should really make a museum of cures for the virus at some point because it's so fascinating. But even analyzing the kinds of cures that are being offered speaks of the culture as well. So I am sure this Madagascar herbal cure taps into people's imagination of nature and of herbs, of the appeal of nature against the virus, the idea that nature heals. So that in itself can be an interesting study. So Duterte in April claiming that an antibody from horses is coming up very soon and the pandemic will be over by May. Again, obviously it didn't work that way. But the fact that people feel compelled to make those claims is interesting.
Look,
So there's a video here, but it's in
look,
Filipino.
in the,
So basically he's
having
just
a,
making fun of people for making fun of him. But then you know what happened there. So simplification is one element that we see all over. The second is spectacularization, performances of crises, dramatization of response. In India, we saw this massive curfew, the Janata curfew, in March 22, I think. So more than a billion people were told to this curfew. It's more symbolic actually than substantive. So we go back to the medical and the political efficacy. So even if we see that there may not be too much of medical efficacy, but there's political efficacy involved. In the Philippines, we saw tanks even rolled out in major cities, and the military was called in, the police. You can see these checkpoints with so many soldiers, a display of force, a display of power. And that's spectacle in itself. It's showing people that they're doing something, even if it's up for debate whether it has actually a biomedical or epidemiological rationale. We also saw in Brazil the displays of denial, very dramatic, theatrical, going to the market, taking off the mask. So I think Donald Trump supposedly recovering from the infection and then dramatically taking off his mask is one very clear example of spectacle that's playing out in many parts of the global south as well. So this is image of in India. We saw in Peru the same kind of force being mobilized against individuals. We saw obviously this impacts people differently. It's mostly the poor who will be affected by these measures. So this is one example. Let me just make sure that when I shared my screen, I have the videos. I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear what Duterte will say here. It's very interesting.
I will not hesitate. My orders are sa pulis pati military, pati mga barangay na pagka ginulo at nagkaroon ng okasyon na lumaban at ang buhay ninyo ay nalagay sa alanganin, shoot them dead.
So as you can see, very, very, very forceful. Shoot them dead. Very strong language, as if the virus can be exterminated through brute force. Obviously not. But that's the way people think that they act. It's very spectacular. It's very dramatic. So even testing itself, independent of the debate whether it has public health value, but politicians obviously see this massive testing exercises as a display of political power in itself. So for China to be able to do this is a display of state power and geopolitical prominence as well. So, so in summary, when we talk about spectacularization, we see these dramatic displays, we see the language of war, we see optics of power, we see even the imagery of conspiracy, etc. So all of this creates spectacle. And the third is the forging of divisions. It can be vertical division, so the public against someone perceived to be powerful. For example, a powerful country like China or a global institution like the WHO. It can also be horizontal, so people who are perceived to be the source of the virus, migrants. Most This is most stark during the SARS when Asians were perceived to be the dangerous others. In the first part of the pandemic, also the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the people who are coming from Asia were being stigmatized, but that changed over time as well. So forging of divisions is another feature that we see as a common response by political actors. So the president in the Philippines going after health workers, going after critics, going after the disobedient ones or the pasaway. So we also see religious divisions being invoked here. So in Tanzania, we see the religious people seen as the good ones, and then those who are against religion as the satanic virus, as the one that are we should go after. So we also see it playing out in geopolitical fault lines. Obviously, in the Arab world and in Iran, they blame the West for the virus, Arab media. So these taps, basically, what we see here is that these divisions are not de novo. It doesn't happen from scratch, but they build on pre-existing prejudice, pre-existing conflict, pre-existing perceptions about a certain institution or a group of people. So we also see here how Maduro in Venezuela are claiming that this is actually a biological war against China. So it rests on knowledge claims. It rests on medical knowledge claims made by leaders. So again, critics in Cambodia, we see, and many other places where the pandemic has been used to silence critics because it's a state of exception, it's an emergency. So there's no more time to discuss this. We need to do it very strongly. So arresting critics, arresting perceived enemies, and finally, making knowledge claims to support all of the above. So it involves spreading fake news, making predictions about the future, not necessarily antagonistic to science. So maybe there are some leaders who are very explicit in their opposition to science. But most of the time, what we see is a selective use of science, an opportunistic use of science. People, leaders would declare that they're science based, they're evidence based, but they're very selective in their use of science. And when the science doesn't contradicts what they want to do, then they will dismiss it. So it's a selective use of science. So this is Duterte again
Meron ng,
claiming,
I cannot mention the pharmaceuticals, the giants.
so claiming that there's
Pero
nothing to
meron
it.
ako nakapag
And these knowledge claims tap into people's sense of masculinity, people's sense of nationalism as well. And interestingly, all over the world, we're hearing this discourse of claiming that the poor somehow have better immunity against the virus. This is, of course, a false a false claim, but somehow it's useful for political leaders to invoke that, perhaps to justify their failure to provide health care for the vulnerable and the marginalized. So we see it in the Philippines, we see it in India, and many other places. We also see promises of vaccination that's coming soon. It's almost like you can make the same headline for many countries. Vaccine will come. The vaccine will come. As early as July, people are promising India, Indonesia, and various other places. So, in summary, we see these elements again of the responses of many, of not all. Of course, there are examples like Vietnam, Thailand, where they took a more technocratic approach. But in many countries, we see these elements, familiar elements, emerging to characterize the responses of politicians. Now, like I said, like I hinted at earlier, it's not necessarily negative for these elements to be used, because this is a complex problem and we need to communicate in simple language. That's something that is clear as well. It makes sense for people to simplify in a way that people can understand. There's also a benefit. It can be argued that there's a benefit in staging some form of ritual or staging some events that make people confident that the government is in control. So I find it striking, for example, that in Singapore, during a time when masks were seen as not really effective. So at that time, people were not recommending masks. But even then, the government decided to distribute masks to a big majority of Singaporeans. So I see that as a way of dramatizing government action, even knowing, even warning that this doesn't really work at the time. And of course, divisions, including going after the elites or perceived elites, can lead to accountability as when there's corruption involved. So these elements are neither negative or positive in themselves. But most of the time, we see that it's actually not the case. That it's good because it it exacerbates political divisions. The simplification and spectacularization is more concerned about political staying power rather than anything else. And what makes it particularly potent in the global south is that there are weaker institutions to challenge political actors. So unlike in some countries where there's pushback from, well, academia is stronger, the political party system is stronger, so there's ways to challenge these claims. But in the global south, there's less accountability and therefore more impetus for politicians to make these claims. There are common tropes also that we see: railing against the West, railing against America, railing against Euro America, tapping into people's sense of persecution, post colonial sentiments. But at the same time, we also have countries within the global south with good responses. And these are tend to be the countries with a strong health system beforehand. And also countries where there's political power within the health sector and they can hold their ground and people trust them as well. So we need to also study what are the conditions that make these countries more technocratic in their approach to the virus. So what do we see moving forward based on this framework? Well, we can see that people will turn more to vaccine messianism. We're already seeing that. And there's good reason for that because thankfully, it seems that there's positive news in that front of vaccines, effective vaccines. But there's also danger in rushing this, especially when there's a race when there's an election coming up and people want to rush a vaccine because any mistake can lead to a scandal. We also see that there might be more blaming, scapegoating. We see states being selfish because of, so we also see it already that people hoarding vaccine stocks, the richer countries and countries in the global south are at risk of being marginalized in terms of equity in vaccine distribution in this sense. So as for medical populism itself, it will depend on the local context, whether this will continue to be a successful style of political actors. We see Bolsonaro seemingly still popular. Duterte is also seemingly very popular still in the Philippines. So even in more popular than those who've taken a technocratic approach and succeeded in controlling the virus in their country. So the political and the biomedical efficacy doesn't necessarily correspond with each other. So what can we do as scholars? I know that many of you are into in social sciences and humanities. So what can we do to respond to this? Well, we can hold leaders to account based on expertise and evidence because even in countries where relatively the academe is weak and with respect to the government, they still listen, especially if you go as a community. In the Philippines, the president listened because it was a collective letter from medical experts. He had no choice but to listen. So in my own paper, when it was cited by the Lancet in September in their commission statement, it made the news in the Philippines and it forced the government to deny being a medical populist. So even if they denied it, I'm sure that somehow it also made them think, I hope, about their approach and they became defensive about it. So we cannot underestimate the power of our scholarship to call out leaders. And so these are two other examples of policies that are clearly, can you see this picture of motorcycle? So somehow some official in the Philippines decided that to prevent the virus, you need to have these barriers in between two people in a motorcycle. But they also have a rule that only people with the same household can ride in the motorcycle. So it's actually quite a contradictory policy. And the motorcycle experts said that it's actually dangerous to put those barriers. It creates drag. It's a hazard. So so ultimately they scrapped it. Ultimately it lasted for a few weeks. But we still need to make a museum of this all of these harebrained ideas that have been proposed. This is beach. They put up white sand in Manila. Again, another dramatic display of force or power, but it's being questioned by experts. So we also need to look at social media and the disinformation that is required to rationalize political responses. I think my colleague Jonathan Ong, spoke about that in the previous keynote. But we have to be mindful as well that this is a gray area because regulating social media can only also lead to abuses by the state. So bringing back the nuance, we have to go back to ethnography. We have to go back to grounded approaches, community-led, community-based researches that seek to understand why government communication appeals to people. What are their perceptions about the virus? What are their perceptions about vaccines, most critically?
Tiniyak na
And beyond looking at presidents, prime ministers, these national level actors, we also have to look at the province level, the state level, and even the district level, town level, because they themselves can do the same elements of medical populism. This is one village in the Philippines where they ordered a curfew and they even caged the teenagers in this very small, obviously it's very dangerous for a pandemic to put people together, but people want to dramatize their action and we also need to hold accountable and analyze local actors. So mass testing as well. And I fear that with this growing sense of distrust for vaccines, for technology, precisely because we cannot grasp it, we cannot see the virus, so we rely on science, we rely on the scientists, but there's growing mistrust. This can be an opening for politicians to make these things populist tropes. We saw this in Europe with the far right in Italy subscribing to anti-vaxxer ideas, and we might see this in areas where there's a high level of mistrust. So we need to be careful. We need to document what's going on. So already in different parts of the world, there's less and less willingness to get vaccines. So we need to get to that while acknowledging with humility that science itself is imperfect and it's evolving. So there was a time that even WHO said that there's no evidence that the mask works in April, only 2 months later to take account the available studies and change their statements saying that, okay, we should have to recommend masks after all. So without the ability to communicate why these recommendations change over time, it might foster mistrust. So we need to present a view of science, not as static, not as a dogmatic truth, but as a dynamic and changing, evolving field of knowledge. So as scholars, we need to document what's going on. This may not be the last pandemic in our lifetimes. I hope it will be the last, but we need to make sure that the lessons are learned for the future. And one way is to analyze the politics of the pandemic. So research is more crucial than ever before. It has to be responsive, interdisciplinary, multi-level, even multi-species, because we need to account for the environment and how political actors also impact the ecosystem at large. So, of course, this is just one part of the picture, but I think the lesson is clear that political actors do carry consequences, and it's to our peril if we fail to hold them to account for these actions. So with that survey of medical populism in the Global South, I end my presentation. And thank you for all of you for listening. I look forward to hearing questions, if any. But again, I'd like to really express my gratitude for this opportunity to share my research to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ong. We would now like to invite anyone watching who would like to join us for the live Q&A to follow the Zoom link that is posted on both Teachable and YouTube. We'll also be reading out any questions that were left for Dr. Lasco while he was presenting.